They were supposed to be enemies. Men who had worn the swastika on their sleeves, whose equations and blueprints had turned into V2 rockets raining death on London. Yet, in the dying months of World War II, the United States didn't just want them alive. It wanted them working for America. Spring 1945. Europe was in ruins. Cities smoldered, bridges lay in twisted heaps of steel, and millions of refugees wandered the roads. The Nazi regime was collapsing, but behind the chaos, another war was being fought. A silent race for minds. Washington had already decided. The next global conflict wouldn't be won only with armies. It would be won with science. And the scientists who could give America an edge were hiding in bombed-out German towns, in secret bunkers, in laboratories that stank of cordite and chemicals. The mission had a name: Operation Paperclip. It wasn't a romantic code word. The paperclip came from the way agents marked dossiers, a simple clip attached to files of men they wanted to extract. Men like Wernher von Braun, the charismatic 33-year-old rocket engineer who had once dreamed of sending man to the moon, but spent the war building weapons for Hitler. Or Arthur Rudolph, production manager of the Mittelwerk rocket factory, where slave laborers died by the thousands assembling the V2s in underground tunnels. These weren't ordinary engineers. They were the best in the world at what they did. And the worst kind of men to have on the other side. The orders were clear: secure the scientists before the Soviets did. The Red Army was advancing fast, and Moscow's own intelligence units were hunting the same targets. Whoever reached these men first would control the future of rocketry, missiles, and maybe space itself. American officers moved like shadows through occupied Germany. Some posed as journalists, others as civilian officials. They arrived in villages with polite smiles and empty notebooks. But they were looking for more than stories. They wanted locations, names, whispers about a neighbor who had worked in Peenemünde or knew about rockets. Many times, they found their targets in the most ordinary places. A man in a faded Luftwaffe jacket, pretending to be a farmer. An engineer hiding in his in-law's attic. A chemist nervously selling potatoes at a market. For the scientists, it was a choice between prison or worse, and a golden ticket to America. Many had been party members, some deeply involved in Nazi crimes. But American intelligence wrote new biographies for them, omitting certain unhelpful details. War crimes? Political affiliations? Those could be blurred. After all, Washington argued, the Soviet Union had no such moral scruples. By summer, truckloads of equipment were rolling out of hidden laboratories, dismantled rocket engines, crates of technical documents, even half-built missiles. Locals would wake up to see entire convoys vanish into the fog, heading west. What they didn't see were the men quietly disappearing too. Flown to American bases under armed guard, their families following weeks later. In the ruins of the Third Reich, there was no shortage of desperation. Some scientists switched sides with ease, seeing the Americans as their best chance to continue their work. Others were coldly pragmatic. The war was over, and survival meant adaptation. A few convinced themselves they could cleanse their past by building for a new flag. But the truth was harder. Every handshake between a U.S. officer and a Nazi scientist was a deal with history's devil. And in those first tense months, the paperwork moved faster than the questions. If you think this is just another war story, it's not. It's the prelude to a chapter that changed the course of the 20th century. One where victory wasn't about who won the last battle, but who owned the future. Subscribe, stay with me, and watch closely. Because what happens next will challenge everything you thought you knew about the end of World War II. The hunt wasn't random. By late 1944, U.S. military intelligence had compiled lists of hundreds of names, scientists, engineers, doctors, all tied to Germany's most advanced military programs. The most coveted were those from Peenemünde, the Baltic coastal site where the V2 rocket had been born. Peenemünde had been bombed into rubble by the RAF, but its people and knowledge were still very much alive, scattered like embers across the Reich. As the Allied armies closed in, these men tried to vanish. Some retreated south, away from the Soviet front. Others went to ground in small towns, carrying nothing but their minds and a few precious papers. But they were being hunted. The Americans called it scientific intelligence, but to the soldiers on the ground, it felt more like espionage. Teams from the U.S. Army's Counterintelligence Corps swept through Germany with a singular purpose: locate the scientists before the Soviets could. The Soviets were no less aggressive. Their own teams, led by the feared Smersh and NKVD, were tearing across eastern Germany, raiding labs, seizing engineers, and shipping them east in sealed trains. It was more than a race for talent. It was a battle for technological supremacy in the post-war world. One of the most decisive moves came in May 1945. Wernher von Braun, along with several key members of his rocket team, surrendered to U.S. forces in Bavaria. They didn't do it out of love for America. They understood the Soviets were approaching their facilities in the north, and if captured, they'd be sent to Moscow, with no guarantee of ever returning. For von Braun, surrendering to the Americans was a calculated gamble. The Americans treated the capture as a coup. Within days, von Braun's team was transported under heavy guard to secure locations. His arm was in a cast from a recent car accident, but his mind was as sharp as ever. He spoke politely to his captors, answering questions in near-perfect English, while quietly negotiating for his team's safety and the inclusion of their families in any relocation. Meanwhile, in the underground hell of Mittelwerk, the scale of Nazi crimes became clear. U.S. troops discovered the Mittelbau-Dora camp, rows of skeletal survivors, hundreds of corpses, and the stench of death. Prisoners had been forced to work around the clock in damp, unlit tunnels, assembling rockets under inhuman conditions. More than 20,000 had died there. And yet, within weeks, the man who had overseen production, Arthur Rudolph, was being prepared for transport to America. His wartime record was quietly filed away under classified. It wasn't just rocket scientists. Chemists who had worked on nerve agents, aviation experts, radar engineers, even doctors who had conducted horrific experiments. Some of them found themselves on the same discrete path west. The guiding logic was cold and clear. If we don't take them, the Russians will. Operation Paperclip wasn't a single convoy or mission. It was dozens of overlapping extractions. Scientists smuggled across occupation zones, sometimes in the dead of night. Entire families spirited away on military planes, storage depots emptied before local officials even knew they existed. The paperwork often came after the fact, with security officers rewriting histories to make their new recruits more palatable to the public. Party membership became political affiliation. SS ranks were omitted entirely. Back in Washington, some officials bristled. The Justice Department and certain Army divisions protested that the United States was protecting war criminals. But the arguments rarely held. The Cold War was already looming, and the fear of Soviet dominance over missiles and atomic weapons outweighed almost every other concern. By the summer of 1945, the first wave of Paperclip scientists was already in American hands. They were housed in secure military facilities, given food, clothing, and a strange kind of guarded freedom. In return, they were expected to talk about designs, prototypes, failed experiments, anything that could accelerate America's military edge. Some gave up their secrets eagerly. Others needed persuasion, promises of new laboratories, and research budgets far beyond what the ruined Reich could offer. And all of them understood one thing: the more valuable their knowledge, the longer they could keep the past from catching up with them. The war in Europe had ended. But for these men, and for the Americans who now guarded them, the real game was just beginning. The first paperclip scientists arrived in the United States in the autumn of 1945. They stepped off military transport planes not as prisoners, but as assets. Their passports had been replaced with U.S. Army identification cards. Their dossiers, heavily redacted, described them as essential to national security. Wernher von Braun and his core rocket team were sent to Fort Bliss, Texas, a desolate stretch of desert that felt a world away from the ruins of Germany. Here, under strict military supervision, they began working with captured V2 rockets, shipped piece by piece from Europe. At nearby White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico, these rockets were reassembled and test-launched, their trails of fire and smoke now climbing into the bright American sky. For the scientists, the adjustment was jarring. They lived in modest army housing, their movements monitored, their mail censored. They were not free to walk the streets without permission. And yet, they were fed well, paid decently, and, most importantly, allowed to continue their work. For men whose lives had been upended by war, it was enough. Von Braun charmed his American handlers. Fluent in English, quick with a smile, he positioned himself as a visionary, speaking of manned spaceflight and lunar landings rather than ballistic missiles. It was an image the Army tolerated, even encouraged. Though everyone knew the Pentagon's immediate interest lay in long-range weapons, not dreams of moon bases. Other paperclip recruits found themselves scattered across the country. In Dayton, Ohio, chemists from IG Farben worked at Wright Field on jet fuels and synthetic materials. In Maryland, biologists and physicians quietly analyzed wartime data from human experiments. Data gathered under conditions that could never be admitted publicly. In New York, engineers studied advanced optics and guidance systems taken from German laboratories. Each man had a minder. Each project had layers of secrecy. The public knew nothing. But life in America had its temptations. The German families who joined their husbands and fathers often embraced their new surroundings, sending children to American schools, shopping in army commissaries, and learning English. The longer they stayed, the harder it was to imagine returning to a shattered homeland. Still, the past clung to them. Arthur Rudolph, working on missile production techniques, was known among some in the Army as the man from Dora, though officially no such nickname existed. Kurt Blome, a Nazi doctor accused of testing chemical weapons on prisoners, found himself giving lectures on biological warfare at U.S. military facilities. The moral compromises were buried under layers of classification. For the U.S. military, the payoff was immediate. Within 2 years, American missile programs had leapt forward, fueled by German expertise. The V2 tests at White Sands paved the way for new designs that would eventually lead to intercontinental ballistic missiles, and later, the rockets of the space race. Behind closed doors, however, there was unease. Some officers feared the scientists were holding back, offering only what was safe to share. Others wondered if men who had served Hitler could truly be trusted with America's most sensitive projects. But Washington kept the program moving. The Soviets were making rapid progress of their own, and falling behind was not an option. By 1948, many paperclip scientists had transitioned from military supervision to civilian contracts, moving into research roles with defense companies or NASA's predecessor, NASA. Their faces began to appear discreetly in technical conferences and scientific journals. In the eyes of the public, they were simply brilliant immigrants contributing to America's technological triumphs. The truth, the full truth, was still locked in government vaults, and it would remain there for decades. Because for all the rockets that rose from the desert, for all the new horizons these men promised, there was a shadow over every launch, the unspoken bargain that had brought them here. By the 1950s, Operation Paperclip was no longer just a classified program. It had become part of America's technological foundation. The scientists who had once built weapons for Hitler were now leading some of the most ambitious projects in U.S. history. And yet, their pasts were never far away. Wernher von Braun had moved from Fort Bliss to Huntsville, Alabama, where he headed the Army Ballistic Missile Agency. His team's designs would lead to the Redstone rocket, America's first nuclear-capable ballistic missile. Later, it would carry the first U.S. astronaut into space. In public, von Braun became a media figure, smiling on television, explaining the wonders of space exploration to a nation captivated by the space race. In private, government censors ensured that no journalist asked about his SS rank or his visits to the Dora tunnels. Arthur Rudolph oversaw large-scale rocket manufacturing in the United States with the same efficiency he had applied in Mittelwerk. For decades, no one in America's mainstream press mentioned the thousands of slave laborers who had died under his watch. Kurt DeBoos, another former Nazi, rose to become the first director of NASA's Kennedy Space Center, overseeing the launches of the Saturn V rockets that took men to the moon. His wartime role as an SS officer was quietly erased from public records. America's leaders told themselves that the bargain had been worth it. The Cold War was in full swing, and every advance in missile technology, every step toward space, was seen as essential to staying ahead of the Soviet Union. The moral compromises, the erased records, the rewritten biographies, were justified as necessary for national survival. But not everyone agreed. In the 1960s and 70s, as the horrors of the Holocaust became more widely documented, journalists and historians began asking questions. Documents were declassified, and the sanitized stories of many paperclip scientists began to crack. Survivors from Dora and other camps spoke of brutal conditions and of the engineers who had walked past dying men on their way to the rocket assembly lines. The revelations sparked outrage. Congressional hearings were called, and some scientists faced public scrutiny for the first time. Arthur Rudolph, lauded for his work on the Saturn V, was investigated for war crimes. In 1984, he agreed to leave the United States and renounce his citizenship rather than face trial. Others, however, managed to live out their lives in comfort, their reputations largely intact. And yet, even as the moral cost became clearer, the legacy of Operation Paperclip remained woven into America's greatest achievements. The same rockets that had once carried explosives to London carried astronauts to the moon. The technologies born in Nazi Germany's laboratories became the backbone of U.S. missile defense and space exploration. This was the paradox at the heart of Paperclip. The undeniable progress, the breathtaking accomplishments, and the fact that they had been built, in part, by men with blood on their hands. Today, the story is no longer secret. Historians have documented the program in detail. But the question it raises has never been fully answered. Was the bargain worth it? Did the end justify the means? Because behind every photograph of an American rocket lifting into the sky is an invisible shadow, the long, dark silhouette of a deal made in the ashes of World War II. A deal where victory wasn't measured only in battles won, but in how far a nation was willing to go to own the future. And that is the true legacy of Operation Paperclip. Not just the rockets, the moon landings, or the Cold War victories, but the moral scar that came with them. A reminder that in the race for power, the lines we swear we'll never cross can disappear in the smoke of history.